There are three different types of relationships that you can have between your entities or tables. You can have one to one, and many to many. Many to many relationships have to be broken down into usually you end up with three tables instead of two tables. You end up with a join table or a linking table. Sometimes it's called a bridge table that lets you connect to the other two. We are going to be taking a look at how to do that today. For one to many and one to one, those relationships are fine. They work well. Most of your relationships are going to be one to many. And that is where you take the primary key from your primary table and you put it into the related table as a foreign key. With a one to one, typically you have a primary key that's in both tables. And usually the second table has some type of composite key. That's usually how you get a one-to-one. But we will be taking a look at that as well. As far as how you create the relationships or how you configure them, you can use convention, which is basically what we have been doing. You can also use attributes, and we have taken a look at that as well. Uh, and finally, you can create relationships with Fluent API. And we're going to be taking a closer look at that today. And I'm actually going to have you code some relationships using Fluent API. So, as far as using the conventions that come with Entity Framework, if we take a primary key and we put it into a related table as a foreign key, which this example is showing. So we've got our blog ID, and we take that and we put that down in the post entity as a property. Entity Framework assumes it's a foreign key. And then we've been including the class name as the data type and as the property. And that's actually called a navigation property. And it's basically indicating that this is the one side of the relationship. So one blog can have many posts. Okay, so we've been mapping out the one side, but what we haven't done is we haven't mapped out the many side. And so we are going to take a closer look at navigation properties. Because the way we need to map out these relationships is we have to map out both sides. So some terminology that you should be familiar with are principal entity, which is the table that has the primary key. So that's your one table. Then you've got a dependent entity, which is the table that you put that primary key into so you can relate. So that's the table that's got the foreign key. And then the navigation properties end up being in both tables. And they basically help Entity Framework identify what is the one table and what is the many table. Okay, so what's the primary table or principal table? What's the dependent table? And as far as navigation properties go, a reference object is used if it is the one or if you have one or zero as far as the relationship goes. And you will use a collection if it is the many side of the relationship. So in the one to many, what we have been doing so far is we've been specifying our one side, but we have not been specifying the many side. So if we take a look at employee and department, A department can have many employees. Okay, so that is the relationship. The department can have more than one. So we're going to take the department ID, we're going to put that under employee as a foreign key. And the navigation property then is going to be the class department as the data type with department as the property. So this is a reference object. This is the one side. So the employee has one department. Now, over in the department table, we have to let it know that a department can have more than one employee. They can have many. So we put the collection into our department class, and that is what we are doing here. So we are indicating that employee is the many side of the relationship. And then here is a graphical display of that same concept. One-to-one relationships can be really tricky for entity framework because sometimes it has a really hard time figuring out what is the primary table and what is the dependent type table, especially if both tables have the same primary key. It gets very confusing for entity framework. Typically, you will have the primary key kind of by itself in one table, and then in the other table, it'll be part of a composite key. Okay, and it's typically that composite key that ends up being the dependent table. In this example, it's a little cleaner just because it's an employee and benefits situation. So I've got employee ID as my primary key. And here I've got a benefit ID. And then I brought in the employee ID as a foreign key. So it's actually pretty clear here that we've related it here. I've got the foreign key. So this is obviously specifying that primary table relationship. And then for the dependent relationship, all I did was add the navigation property to employee. So we have one-to-one where the employee is the primary table. And I've taken the employee ID, thrown it down here in benefits, along with the navigation. And then for the flip side, to get that full relationship, I just pulled in the navigation property up into employee. And we are not going to talk about many-to-many yet. You actually are going to have a many-to-many relationship that you are going to end up resolving. The best way to do that is to create a table. It's called a join table, a linking table. It's also called a bridge table, and it's basically used to connect the two tables together. So it kind of goes in the middle, and you will see how to do that.